Welcome to Your Next Door Neighbor. On this episode, we have our next door neighbor,
Rick Lupert, poet, neighbor, poet,
singer,
musician. What we call him a Jewish study boy too.
Yeah, he has written poetry about his travels, and he's also written poetry about the Torah. And rather fascinating guy, and with great sense of humor.
Yeah, great sense of humor.
And his poetry reflects the great sense of humor.
And his life, I think, and his observations about life, and his observations about other people and places. And in fact, he does a book a year.
Yeah, he writes
poetry on a destination a year. And I think last year was Seattle. Was he saying?
Seattle. Yeah. So we hope you enjoy this episode of Your Next Door Neighbor.
Rick Lupert.
My name is Rick Lupert, and I was born in Englewood, New Jersey in 1968.
1968 was a good year.
I don't have a lot of memory of it. Most of my memories started later. I don't know how far back you want me to go in terms of my memories. I know I was in the womb, but I don't remember coming out. I don't remember really anything before that. I think I was a zygote. I assume there was a lot of moisture. But I'm just guessing at this point what I might have experienced back then. I know I was separately a sperm and an egg too, and I was thinking recently how great it would be to kind of get back to that. You could just get so much more done if you were these two separate things. So those are my earliest non-memories.
You're a New Jerseyan?
I am, in so much that I was born there and lived there for less than a year. My parents were not born there.
Where are they from?
My mom is from Syracuse, New York. My dad, I think, is from the Bronx in New York City. And they met in Syracuse. They were both in high school there. I don't think they met in high school. They met. My mom was a singer was a singer. Period. All over central New York, and she was a really accomplished for her age jazz singer, and did really well until she met my dad, and then who took her away from all of that, and they got married and moved to New Jersey, and pretty soon after that they moved to Florida. They moved to the Miami area of Florida, which is where I started having memories. And
what did your dad do?
It's a really great question. I know for sure that my dad was and is a fitness trainer. He's spent a great deal of his life involved with fitness. He's trained and worked with all kinds of people like Stallone and Schwarzenegger and sporting teams and things like that. And he was just inducted a couple of years ago into the National Fitness Hall of Fame. So he was a pretty big deal. He's 80 now, and if you were to meet him, you would not think he was 80. He's still really fit. He still trains people. Fitness has been the through line of his life, I would say.
Did he train you? Did you work with him on that?
He did not train me. No one trained me. I'm waiting for my training.
So you grew up in the Miami area.
I started growing up. There's a lot of suspicion that I never actually grew up, to be honest with you. And so I'm not sure that I grew up, but I spent the first 6 or 7 years after that first year in New Jersey in Fort Lauderdale. And then, by that time, my dad was out of the picture. My mom wanted to move back to Syracuse, where she grew up, so we moved back to Syracuse, New York, which is a place that I had never been to, or I wasn't born to, but which I kind of feel like I'm from because it's where my mom's family is from. And so we spent 6 years there.
So you went from the warm,
wonderful Fort Lauderdale climate
to
Syracuse. Which is a fabulous place, just has winter.
Yeah, I like Syracuse, and every time I go back, which has been a handful of times since I reconnected with my cousins, It just feels like a place that I'm from, even though I'm not from. And there's just my family history is there. It's a cool place. But you're right, it's freezing there in the winter. I had a paper route when I was, I don't know, 11, 12 or so. And I had to, one day it was 20 degrees below zero. And the snow was, I'm already not tall, so the snow doesn't have to be that tall to have an effect on me. And it was literally 20 degrees below zero. That's not an exaggeration. And a stack of papers is there at the front door. And I had to get up in the morning to do this, which already, I don't know what I was thinking, because these days, whatever I can do to not have to get up in the morning is my kind of status quo. And there's no we here. That day, I took the stack of papers and I threw them in the dumpster and I went back to bed, thinking no one needs the news at 20 degrees below zero. So I don't think, and then that's got
news enough.
That got really easy to do, and I just stopped delivering the papers. And eventually, people realized, well, no one's getting the newspaper. What's going on? And the guy who was in charge came by to have a talk, and I was like, I don't know what's happening. Maybe someone's following me around and taking the papers. Tried to get out of it, and eventually, and they kept paying me, and this went, for months, and eventually, the papers stopped coming, and they stopped paying me. But my finest moment. At the end of 6 years in Syracuse, we moved to L.A. We traveled to L.A. on a Greyhound bus. 3 days. My mom and I. She was enrolled in a correspondence law school. She'd gotten a bachelor's degree in criminal justice, maybe a master's degree, and decided she wanted to pursue law. She got accepted to this unaccredited correspondence law school in LA and figured since she was studying California law that she should live here. So we packed up some things in some suitcases, we shipped a bunch of other things, and we got on a 3-day bus trip to Southern California, which I think was fun at the time, but sounds like the worst possible thing you could do. I remember I was wearing golf pants. I don't know why I had those pants. I don't know I don't recall having any input on the clothes that I wore at that time in my life. But I remember not having a change of clothes for 3 days. I remember we stopped in Las Vegas, and that was the only place where we got off the bus and spent some time because my mom needed to spend money gambling, and I think I got a roll of quarters and went to the arcade at the Circus casino. And then a little while later, she came in with another roll of quarters, so I guess it was going well. I was 13 years old, just before I turned 14. This was middle of August. And eventually she came back, and we got on the bus and made it the rest of the way to Pasadena. And I remember getting off the bus. I'd never been to Southern California. At this point, I'd never been on a plane. I still hadn't been on a plane by that point.
Had your mother ever been to Southern California?
I think so. I think she flew out to maybe take I honestly don't know the answer to that question, so I think so. But I remember we got off the bus in Pasadena where we had an apartment reserved for us, which turned out to be a studio apartment, a no-bedroom apartment with a kitchen and a bathroom. And we built a wall of boxes between two sides of the room, and I slept on one side and she slept on the other side. I don't think she knew that was what we were getting, but it was what she could afford at the time. But I remember getting off the bus in Pasadena and being excited to be in Southern California, and I asked the bus driver, do you know where the ocean is? Or which way is the ocean? We're in Pasadena, where there's no ocean in Pasadena. And he goes, this is exactly what he said. He said, do you see where the mountains aren't? And I'm like, yeah. And he goes, that's where the ocean is. That was my introduction to Southern California.
So you were 12 or 13 years old?
I was 13. I just finished 8th grade and was going to start high school, 9th grade, at Temple City High School in Temple City, California.
Now, your mom took this class unaccredited.
What happened?
The only good thing that came, it wasn't a class, it was a full-on unaccredited university, with a series of classes that that you take over the course of a few years. And if you're enrolled in an unaccredited university, you're required to take what they call the baby bar exam. It's a first-year bar exam that you don't have to take if you're in an accredited law school. So she didn't pass that exam, and that started on a multi-year quest to try to get the first year bar exam declared unfair, which she took all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States and lost, and it never went anywhere. And when I had to clean out my mom's stuff after she passed away a few years ago, there was a bunch of stuff in a storage unit which I didn't get to cleaning out until a few years after she passed away. Most of the papers in there were all of these legal documents of her basically trying to sue anyone she could think of to declare the first year bar exam not fair, basically. And she lost.
How did
That's
you
the
guys,
spirit of a lawyer, though. There you go.
how did you guys survive? What kind of jobs did you do?
We barely survived.
Yeah.
Well, we survived. I mean, that
Yeah.
doesn't sound so... But the money was always an issue. The whole time in Syracuse, we never had a car. The whole time in LA, we never had a car. I had to take the bus everywhere, rely on friends. She couldn't hold down a job. She was a smoker. She was a hardcore smoker, and would not hear a word from anyone about smoking is unhealthy. You shouldn't smoke. When she finally got a job, she would take a lot of smoking breaks and lose the job. At a time after we'd been evicted a couple of times, she landed a full-time job after lots of temp jobs, and lost it because of all these smoking breaks. And none of that was a message to her that smoking is something she shouldn't do. It was something that she was adamant about until the day that she died. Well, I can't say that legitimately because she wasn't talking on that day, but when she was in hospice, she really wanted to go get cigarettes, But we were evicted, I think, 3 times from apartments that we couldn't afford to pay the rent on. And at the end of my high school year, we were about to get evicted, and she made a point of we got placed by our synagogue to help us out in a temporary apartment, which happened to be a few blocks outside of the school district. So my mom felt it was important that she call my high school to let them know that we lived in this other place now. And I almost got kicked out of school because I didn't live in the district anymore. I mean, I literally got called into the school office one day as a senior, in the middle of my senior year, and at this point I'm really starting to develop who I am and become a person and have my own friends, and I well into realizing that my mom was kind of crazy and not able to take care of me. And so I get called in and say, well, we understand you don't live in the district, so we have to unenroll you from school. And it's like, that's not really something I wanted to hear or do. So luckily, some friends of mine who lived in the district took me in on a temporary basis until my mom got in another apartment, which, so I got through high school, just barely. I mean, I did fine in high school, but barely, by being evicted a number of times and not living in the district for a night or two. And then the year after high school, it was going to happen again. I guess that was the 3rd time we were about to be evicted. I was working hard as a McDonald's employee in Temple City, California, and I was crew member of the month in October of 1986. I was doing really well there, and I was started to help paying the rent, with my high-paying job at McDonald's, and eventually it got to the point where I couldn't pay all the rent and she couldn't pay any of it, and I ended up moving out and getting an apartment with a friend not too far away. And not too long after that, my mom got evicted and called me up and said, "Can I stay with you for a few days?" So you can imagine, if anyone's ever had the experience of finally moving out, forget about the reasons why. Forget about the fact that it's because it was like a survival thing. Finally this independence. I'm living with a roommate. I've got my own apartment. It's exciting, and a month or two into it, my mom is now sleeping on the couch, and the only thing we asked her was you can't smoke in the house. That was the only thing we asked her. And so one day I get a call from my roommate. By this point, a couple jobs later, I'm working at Radio Shack, also excelling there as a salesperson. I get a call from my roommate and said, your mom is smoking on the couch. I just came home and she's smoking on the couch. And I said, well, I guess you got to ask her to leave. I couldn't make a case. My roommate hated her, and she's did the one thing that we asked her not to do. She couldn't even walk out to the porch. And so she left, and she was homeless for a short period of time. Very quickly got into it might have been a shelter. It was kind of like a halfway house kind of thing. And she got into the system, basically, and then ended up being in an apartment in a subsidized housing building in Pasadena, right in the heart of downtown Pasadena, right at, a block away from Fair Oaks and Colorado Boulevard, which is the crux of gentrified where you want to go when you go to Pasadena. And a block away from there is this beautiful old hotel called the Green Hotel, which is where my wife and I got married, in the ballroom there, which was a gorgeous place, and partially because it was affordable, partially because it was gorgeous, and partially because I knew my mom would be able to get there because she lived in the building, in the subsidized housing they maintained above, and she was there for many years, until she had some health problems and had to basically go into kind of hospice care in other places.
So you're a poet, writer, and did that start developing in high school? Did you start loving words at that point? How did that all happen for you?
I think in high school I started to develop a sense of humor and a sense of the absurd. I watched a lot of Monty Python. I was reading Douglas Adams books. And so I started to see the world in kind of this more absurd way. And I didn't really start writing in high school, but that sensibility from which I write kind of came from what was going on at that time. I started to write later when I used to work at a radio station. There was a radio station in the San Fernando Valley called KGIL, which in its heyday, 1260 AM, was a big deal here, and towards the end wasn't so much a big deal, but it was cool working there. It was a news talk radio station, and I did two things. I was a board operator, which they called us engineers, but it's a weird term for that. I was just operating the radio station, pointing at people when it was their turn to talk, pressing the buttons to start the commercials, that kind of thing. And there was an FM station there, which for a short time, until they sold the radio stations, when we all lost our jobs there, where I was Quick Rick, and I would drive a big pink van around the San Fernando Valley and park at places and do call-ins to the morning show host. Another situation where I had to wake up very early in the morning, so it was to be on the radio, so it felt like it was worth it. And I'd say, hey, I'm over at Ralph's at Balboa and Devonshire, and I've got zoo tickets. Come on down. The first person, zoo tickets was like the height of what our promotions department could give away. It was a really low budget station. But at that point, when I was sitting for hours in the radio station as an operator, I would just start doodling and writing things down, and that's kind of where the poetry started.
So in high school, and that was after high school.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in high school, you weren't on the newspaper. I don't even know if they had those things when you were.
I was on the newspaper actually in high school, the Rampage, in my senior year, and I had a great time writing it. I had no history of being a writer before getting on the newspaper. It was fun to do, and I wasn't writing poetry, but occasionally I got to write silly articles or do kinds of crazy different things there. So maybe the seeds of it were there, but it was really different writing from poetry. That was journalism with no history or education in journalism, writing articles about what was going on, and occasionally some kind of more human or student interest stories about the history of the school and that kind of thing.
So you graduated high school.
Into college, yeah. I was
Yeah,
saying, from high school to college, or
Did you take a break?
onward?
I'm still taking a break, actually. I went to college. I went to 3 different schools over the course of a few different years. I started right out at Cal State LA. I didn't have the discipline to stay there. Following some year, I went to Pasadena City College, and took broadcasting classes. And then I got the job at the radio station out of that. And then I was working in broadcasting, so I stopped that. I went to Lee College, which was an undergraduate school at the University of Judaism, for a while, which I liked a lot because I'd always been involved with Jewish stuff at temples and working on camp weekends and teaching classes and Sunday school and that kind of thing. So it kind of made sense to try that place out. And I still didn't really have the discipline to finish. And I took classes after that at Valley College, and nothing came of it. And I think at least at this point, a certain number of decades after graduating high school, college is sort of on hold.
So there'd be no returning to finish that degree?
Not at the moment, but never say never.
No, that's true.
Never say never.
You mentioned the Jewish organizations that helped you guys survive, live, and then you just mentioned that you worked at the temple. Which temples were that? Was it a specific one, or?
Yeah, when we moved to California, we belonged to Temple Beth David in Temple City, and I wasn't really that involved there, but because of being enrolled in the confirmation class at the time, I ended up there was a program that was run by the local Jewish Federation where kids would meet for high school level classes at different synagogues all over LA. And about 5 or 6 times during the year, all the kids would go to a camp weekend. Right. So that's what I got hooked up with in 9th grade. And I was sure I didn't want to go on these camp weekends. It just seemed, to me, going to temple was a symbol of when I used to be in Boy Scouts in Syracuse, and when we came to California, Boy Scouts was on the same day as temple class, and so to me, all that temple represented was I can't go to Boy Scouts anymore. So I didn't go on the first 4 of 6 camp weekends because I knew I would hate them. And then, as I became more Californian, I don't know why, but I went on the 5th of 6 camp weekends at a lovely place called Camp Hilltop in Malibu, which has since burned down with the fires that happened a few months ago. And I got off the bus, and my teacher is sitting on the ground playing a sitar, and there was this beautiful girl named Ilana who lived in La Habra, whose phone number from 1982 I still know. And it was like this whole different world. It was like I'd arrived at my Woodstock, basically. It was this whole other world. And I went on the next weekend, and I went on the weekends the following year as a 10th grader, and then I became a counselor, and I worked on those programs for 12 years. And so I really, I kind of became a Jewish person, not connected to a temple, but because of this idea of going to camp.
Also, in a way, it had to give you a sense of family.
Sense of identity, too?
Yeah.
It had to be your family.
You're still involved, right?
Yeah, the one through line besides poetry of my whole life has been, well, starting in ninth grade, has been a connection to being Jewish. These days, in addition to having taught classes for 12 years and been a counselor on these weekends for 12 years, I've been a summer camp song leader, and I still work at synagogues as a music teacher. And that's how I met my wife. I went to a Jewish music educators conference in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin.
I've been there.
Yeah?
I went to camp there 2 years in a row.
Well, that's where I met my wife. She was living in Kansas City at the time, and she was a senior in college, a music education student, and we met at this camp. And 6 months later, she was living in LA with me. I'd convinced her to do her student teaching here in LA, and now she's a professional Jewish music educator at a day school. And it's this conference that we went to in terms of identity and family. The people who I met there in, I think 1996 was the first year I went there, are people who I still talk to and still connect with. And I haven't missed a year going back to this conference. It's this coming up this June. It'll be 24 years in a row.
So you haven't mentioned music up until now. How is it you turned out to be a music teacher?
Yeah. I didn't even know that.
Yeah, we're like,
I get that
we're
question.
Talking poetry, we're talking life, where you are.
I get that question every day
music?
at work. How the hell did you?
What instruments do
Really?
you play?
Okay, so senior year of high school, a good friend of mine in the San Gabriel Valley showed me how to play guitar. He showed me a few chords, and so I suddenly became a guitar player. And I really, whenever anyone asks about playing guitar, I would say, you can learn how to play guitar in 5 minutes. I can teach you in 5 minutes how to play guitar. You won't be very good, but you'll know exactly everything you need to know to play the guitar, and then it's just learning more of the things that I've taught you. So it started when I was 18. I'm 50 now, and one of the big things that happens at camp is someone is a song leader, and there are song sessions. There's singing after all the meals. There's singing that happens during prayer services, and that's where the real emotional energy of camp happens. And if you like music, you're going to fall in love with being in that environment, and that's going to be the part that really just grabs you and hooks you and gets you. So one day at camp, a few years into working on these weekends, I was a guy who knew how to play a bunch of chords and could kind of fumble my way through some songs. And I had a book which had some Jewish songs in it with the chords listed above it. So the guy who was a song leader, who was a really good friend of mine, who was also my roommate, he wasn't my roommate at the time actually, but a guy who I knew who ended up being a roommate of mine. Sorry for padding. I know that that's something you guys don't want to hear. I apologize for that.
Don't worry about it.
I've got rhythm in me, and I need to get it out. So my roommate needed to leave camp to go to his teaching gig on Sunday morning at the synagogue that he worked at. So there wasn't going to be anyone to lead music for the Sunday morning service. And so I was thinking, I bet I could play a song. I bet I could get up and lead one song. So I go to the guy who's in charge, and say, I can do this one song, maybe at the end of the service. So he says, okay, great, let's do it. So the whole service goes on, from beginning to end, without any music, without any guitar, people just kind of chanting a cappella, the stuff that they chant. I say, okay, we're going to end with this song. So I get out the book that has the chords in it, I put it right there, and we're kind of in an amphitheater. So I put it on the upper amphitheater step, it's an outdoor amphitheater. I get out my guitar, and I'm kind of looking at the book the whole time, and I'm just playing these 4 chords to the song over and over and singing it. And I don't know that I looked at anyone who I was singing with at the time, and that was it. That was my first experience as a song leader. And through subsequent years, I felt confident enough to kind of get up with my guitar and stand next to the person who was leading it, and learned a lot of Jewish songs. Never thought that I could be a song leader. I just knew that I could stand there with my guitar and play along. And then finally, one guy who was a song leader said, "It's time. You should be doing this." And so I I looked for a job as a song leader.
Yeah, what is a
You
song?
found your
What-
rock star moment.
I did.
So
And-
what is a song leader?
A song leader is responsible for leading people in songs. It's not in ideal sense. You just said it was a rock star moment, but when you really start to learn what you're supposed to be doing as a song leader, you're not a rock star. Ideally, you're someone who's kind of jump starting people and letting the group sing and hear themselves. My best moments as a song leader are when I've done that and I'm just playing along and I've backed off the mic or I've stopped singing altogether and the singing is happening. You're creating these moments of communal singing in all kinds of settings, whether it's a prayer setting or a song session where you're just singing for fun, or in a music class setting, and that's what I've been doing pretty consistently since 1995, I think.
And you work for one organization, or do you go to? I mean, is it?
I work every Sunday as the music teacher at a synagogue in Northridge. I'm the music teacher, so I lead different classes of different grades that come in. I lead a large group worship service, which is done in a camp style where I'm playing guitar and doing the not so much traditional melodies, but like kind of the newer camp tunes to the prayers, which makes it fun and accessible to everyone. And it's kind of interesting. I do that in a place which is really rooted in tradition. So there's, I come in as a really much more liberal person with a respect for the tradition, but really having come to it myself through this Woodstockian sing-along kind of vibe. That's really what I need to bring them. I need to bring them these songs that they can connect with right away, because it's melodies that they get.
As a song leader, do you do weddings or bar mitzvahs or funerals or anything like that? Or do they call you in for other aspects?
Yeah, I've done all of those things. I've done a couple of weddings. My wife and I have done a lot of bar and bat mitzvahs through a synagogue that we used to work at, and we actually just led one last weekend, as a matter of fact. And what was the other thing? Weddings, bar mitzvah?
Funerals.
I did a funeral once. Yeah, I mean, funerals are not so much sing-alongs. Yeah, though I don't know why. I mean, they're really, every funeral that I've been to, and I've only played music at one, has been kind of a humorous occasion, because everyone who gets up to talk has funny things to say about the person.
Right.
I have never been to a funeral where there hasn't been laughing. So I don't know why they're not, there isn't more moments, and maybe there are. I don't know how many funerals I've been relative to other people.
Your wife in the Carnival Walk.
Yeah.
How old were you when that happened?
I have to do some math to figure it out. It's 17 years ago almost. So what's that? 43. I think it was
43.
Or not 43. 33. 33. Thank you. I never finished college, so it's these kind of high level questions I didn't know I was going to have to answer.
So all these things that you were practicing, the guitar and learning all that all happened during that time period, prior to meeting your wife.
Yeah.
Okay. So when did you start writing your poetry?
Well, when I was working at the radio station in my, I guess, early 20s is when I started writing things down and writing things in little notebooks and carrying them around. I didn't know I was writing poetry. It may not have been. I knew I was writing things, and there were lots of short little observations and things like that. In fact, one day at the radio station, Art Garfunkel was a guest. Now, I'm not a guy who's so excited about famous people, but if it's a famous person whose work I love, that's exciting to me. That's a big deal. And here's Art Garfunkel, who was, as you may know, in a group called Simon and Garfunkel, who had a tremendous impact on me and millions of other people. And he's sitting across the glass from me, right? And so when the interview was over, I take my little book of thoughts and I walk into the studio and say, Mr. Garfunkel. And he, by the way, was promoting a book of poetry that he'd just written. So I hand him my book and I say, Mr. Garfunkel, I love your music. I've been singing it for years. This is a book of my thoughts, so it means so much for me if you would sign it. And so he says, sure, absolutely. And he takes the book and he signs it and he writes, Rick, I'm your next thought, Art Garfunkel. Which was amazing. And then I lost that little journal, which is, I have no idea where it went. I have every other journal. I have every other little journal that I kept, that I wrote in. And now I write everything in my phone. I'm never writing on, or on the computer. It's never on paper anymore.
Oh, yeah. Words written on paper here.
Well, yeah, but they get typed in, and then someone else prints them out. But so around that time, as things started to get longer, and I was, well, what am I doing here? And I saw in the LA Weekly there was an advertisement for an event at a place called the Iguana Cafe, which no longer exists, but they were having an event called the Poetry Circle, and I didn't know anyone there. I'd never been to anything like this, and so I took my little book of ridiculous things, and I went to this thing. It was on a Sunday afternoon, and I figured I'm going to read my poem. And this isn't a poetry reading. This isn't an open mic. It's you read a poem, everyone critiques it, and then you move on to the next person. And I knew I'm going to read this stuff, and they were going to go, oh, no, that's not poetry. And then I would just move on, and that would be it, right? And move on to whatever the next thing was. And there were people there who I know who were in the room. Amelie Frank was in the room that day. Matthew Niblock was in the room that day. And a bunch of other people who I still know today, a bunch of years later. And they loved what I did, and there was humor in it, and they were just, it just opened up this whole other world of stuff. And since then, there's never been a time that I haven't been involved with poetry in LA. This was 1990, I think I walked into that room, the Iguana Cafe, which spawned all kinds of amazing people who are still artists today. People like Viggo Mortensen, people like Dan Byrne, who had a lot of successes, still is having a lot of success as a singer-songwriter, and people who were just artists because it was really important to do, and people who still really work hard to live as artists. That place is sadly gone, but the spirit of it, is still with us.
So years and years of poetry. How many books to date?
Pretty soon it'll be 23. My next book comes out in a few weeks. It's called Hunka Hunka Howdy, which is poems written last summer while Addie and I were in Memphis, Nashville, and Louisville.
And would you like to read
a poem? Yeah.
Sure. I brought 3 different books to kind of give you an overview of the different kinds of books I've put out. This is a proper collection of poetry. And it's my second kind of...
Making Love to the 50-Foot Woman?
That's what it's called, Making Love to the 50-Foot Woman. And that poem is in there. And so I'm going to read a short poem from this book. This is collected poems over time. This is a short one called This Thought, Too Many Syllables for Haiku. The biscuits didn't turn out as I'd hoped because too much baking soda...
I got it.
That's the first one. This is the most recent travel poetry book. It came out last May. Poems that I wrote when Addie and I were...
The title, I can't see it. Your fingers are covering that.
Sorry, the title is Beautiful Mistakes, which is something that our tour guide in the old city of Seattle, the underground city of Seattle, said. She was talking about all of the foibles of making Seattle a city and how they all turned into beautiful mistakes. So that's the title of this book, written while we traveled through Seattle, Snoqualmie, Washington, better known as Twin Peaks, where Twin Peaks was set and filmed, and Portland, Oregon. And this was written just before we went on the trip. This is, I talked a lot about camp. This summer was the first time we took our kid to summer camp. So we took him to summer camp before we went on our vacation. This is about that. It's called Separation Anxiety. We delivered our child to sleepaway camp for his first time, and essentially ours too. I wasn't prepared for the weight of this. I had a speech ready. Try new things, meet new people, be safe and kind. All I could muster was, we love you and we'll see you soon. He saw it in my eyes, and though he took issue with how soon exactly 12 days is, said, don't worry, I won't die. That's all I ask of his caretakers, that he doesn't die, that he comes back with at least most of his limbs, that this new experience doesn't change him forever. But if he does it right, it will. 12 independent days. He already told me, Daddy, it's my hair, the other day when I wanted him to get a haircut. Let his golden hair shake wildly in the hills of Simi Valley. Let him become the person he already is.
Wow.
So there's that one. And then I've been writing a lot of Jewish poetry lately, and for a bunch of years now. And so, in Judaism, we have a tradition of studying the Torah every week. And like most traditions, no one actually does this. But I'd been writing a bunch of Jewish poetry and reading it at these camp weekends and things like that. And I really wanted to kind of figure out a way to immerse myself in this tradition. So I thought, well, why not write a poem every week for the Torah portion? So I kept having that idea in the middle of the year when the Torah was like halfway done, and I kept using that as an excuse to not start. I thought, oh no, I have to start at the beginning if I'm going to do this. So a few years ago, I actually did it, and they all got collected in this book called God Wrestler, which is a poem for every Torah portion. So I will read the very first one. If you're not familiar with the Torah, at the beginning the world gets created, and otherwise nothing else can happen because there's nowhere for it to happen. So this is the story of the creation of the world, my interpretation in the poem, which is called Breshit, which is the Hebrew word for in the beginning. In the beginning, God made everything. According to scientists, the beginning took billions of years. I've taken to counting my ribs. I want there to be one less so I have something to believe in. At the very least, I'm responsible for naming the animals who live in my house. I've built a garden in the front and in the back. I can't eat the fruit because the possum gets there first. I call a man in periodically to keep it looking like paradise. He brings others to help him. There are so many more people eating forbidden fruits than when all this started.
So what's your process? Do you mentioned that you write a lot of your work is based on road trips. But when you do something like this with the Torah, is there a way you could describe how you get from reading the Torah to what you just wrote?
Sure. It's a very different process from most of the rest of my poetry, which is written when an idea comes to me, and I just make a point of making sure to write that idea down. And sometimes that turns into longer poems, and sometimes it's short little observations. Sometimes I just think of a punchline, and I want that to be a poem, and I want to get there as quickly as possible. So it's really very much on the fly. I mean, that sensibility. I was picking my son up from school, and on the way I'm listening to the New Orleans radio station, and a little promo for Minnie's hot sauce came on, or something like that, and I was just, it just occurred to me, well, does Minnie make the hot sauce, or is it made out of Minnie, and is she okay with that? So like that's how kind of I perceive the world, and so a lot of my poetry comes from that sensibility, hearing these things in not necessarily the way that they were intended. And when I write the Torah portion poems, to some extent that happens because I actually sit down. I have to do this because I have a blog on a Jewish website at jewishjournal.com, and I don't think they actually care if I keep doing it or not, but I feel like I have a commitment to doing this. So every Thursday, I'll sit down and I'll call up the Torah portion. I actually go to the Chabad website, which is probably the most antithetical, practice to my very liberal Jewish practice, but they've got a lot of material there, and they've got authentic translations, and they've got it all there. So I know if I go there, I'm going to see what I need to see. So I read the portion, I read through the text of that week in English, and I try to, in this book that I just read from, I was trying to find something to grasp onto, some idea to respond to. And sometimes I would focus on one sentence and then write a poem kind of responding to it. Sometimes I would find like 2 or 3 sentences that were kind of interesting, that the way that they were phrased, and so I would write a few stanzas just responding to that. So it might be a 2 or 3 part poem. One year I wrote each Torah portion is actually divided into 7 sections. And if you go to a bar bat mitzvah or to a Saturday morning Torah service, you might hear 7 aliyot, 7 times when someone is called up to read each section. So those sections were determined by rabbis hundreds of years ago. It's not something that we thought up lately to make it into smaller chunks for our modern sensibility. So there's 7 of these sections. So one year, a couple of years ago, I wrote a haiku for each section. So every year I wrote 7 haiku, and every week I wrote 7 haiku. This year what I'm doing, because it's hard to come up with ideas of what to do since I've already written poems for it, but the idea is to not stop immersing yourself in this text. And that's a challenge. I mean, I read the first poem about the creation of the world there. It's not like that text is different next year. It's not like, okay, well, in the original, it took God 6 days to make the world, and this year I'm reading it actually took him 12 days, and instead of zebras, he made, I don't know what, I can't think of a fake animal, but imagine a fake animal that God made. It's the same text every year, right? And so you're looking at the same text and thinking, well, didn't I just read this last year? What's different about it? And so as you go through your life, you have different ideas and different thoughts and different things come to you. So it is a bit of a challenge to look at the text. But this year, I'm again looking at these 7 aliyot, these 7 sections, and I'm finding 2 or 3 phrases in just the first section. Every week this year, it's just the first section. And I'm writing 2 or 3 short poems or parts to one poem that respond to this one sentence, whatever it is, that kind of that speaks to me or stands out to me in some way. And I'm only looking at the first aliyah this year. Next year, I'm only going to look at the second one. I just started that this year. So this is like a 7-year project that I've launched into. And in the end, I'm going to put out like a 10,000 page book with with all of these poems. And there's really no difference in what I'm doing and what the rabbis did in the Middle Ages, who looked at the Torah and wrote all these other sacred texts that we look to for our interpretations. Like anyone who interprets the Torah is doing the same exact thing as the famous rabbis who developed rabbinic Judaism basically by interpreting the Torah and figuring out what our rituals are today that we should be doing.
Are all your books self-published?
No, a lot of them are. The earlier ones were, some of them, the earlier ones were put out by local small presses, people who I knew from the Iguana Cafe who started a press, believed in me enough to put out my books. But almost consistently, even whether or not I put it out under my own imprint or on someone else's, I'm the person who does all the layout and design on my books. I kind of have a system down. I'm a graphic designer. I have my own sensibility. I know what it wants to look like, and I don't really want to have conversations with people about what it should look like or that kind of thing. I love proofreading edits and that kind of thing, and I gratefully take those because I'm really not a great proofreader. I've put out books with mistakes in them and then had to re-put them out. But my most recent books, my most recent travel books, came out on a press called Rothko Press, who were a group of people also active during that early time when I was in poetry in the 90s. They put out a magazine called Caffeine Magazine, which came out for 4 or 5 years or so. And they were the last people to publish Charles Bukowski, who was a major poet out of Los Angeles, who wrote really accessible poetry that was a bridge to many people into poetry who were kind of afraid of kind of the more traditional old school stuff, classic stuff that came out, and who also was very offensive to a lot of people and a bridge away from his kind of poetry as well. So they started a press a few years ago, and they reached out to the people they knew in the poetry community who they thought were good, who were kind of characters as well, to kind of parlay books that they put out into their other business, their main business, which is their television producers, their reality television producers. So the idea behind it was that they might be able to parlay some of these authors that they publish into guest spots on TV programs, or maybe if you've got a clever title or theme, maybe another media project will come out of it or something like that. So far, none of that has happened, but it's sure nice to be able to say, oh, I'm on this press, and they've got a website and people can go there, and it's so there's the idea that I'm not putting these books out myself.
So do you go out on any kind of promotional tours?
I do a lot of readings in LA.
From what I understand, you're doing them every week. Or did I get that wrong? From your wife.
I haven't done that many readings lately, but sometimes I'm doing several a month. Sometimes a lot come out. When I put out my next book, I expect a lot of people to say, "Hey, can you come to our place and do this reading?" That kind of expands throughout the greater Southern California region. In terms of reading other places, it's really tough when you're an independently produced author to expand your reach beyond your local community. People are willing to give me readings in other cities, but I kind of have to get there myself and that kind of thing. And that's a big chunk of money when you're selling 5 or 10 books at a reading, and maybe a handful more, online and that kind of thing. So it's sometimes hard to justify spending that money. But the Jewish poetry actually is a whole different ballgame. I've just came from Seattle last week, where a synagogue invited me to read poetry as part of their Shabbat service, and read from my book God Wrestler and that kind of thing. So that's kind of cool. I've had the opportunity to go to a number of places over the last couple of years where they fly you in and they put you up in a hotel and they pay you a big chunk of money. Maybe not rock star money, but if you're a poet, it sure feels like rock star money.
You can buy coffee while you're there.
Yeah, more than that.
A bagel too.
Yeah. So that's something that's kind of up and coming with me. That's where a lot of my focus is in terms of being able to go to other places outside of LA and read poetry.
That's my next question. How do you see what's in the future for you? How do you expand your presence? It seems like the Jewish connection is certainly there.
It is, and because of this music conference that I go to every year that I talked about, it's called Havana Shira. It's the one that's at the camp in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin. Okay. It's a Jewish music educators conference.
This is where you met your wife.
Yes, that's where I met my wife, and I go there every year. And there are people there who are big deals at synagogues all over the world. And so all of the times that I've had the opportunity to travel somewhere, Chicago or Seattle or Vail, Colorado or Brooklyn, it's because someone I know from this conference knows me and my work and knows how it flies in front of people and really wants to bring me in.
So you go to these synagogues around the country. Is there something walking in? I mean, what's the feeling like when you walk into these places? Is it a spiritual quality to what you're doing? Is it a job? you're going into these different houses of worship. That means different things to different
fairly
people.
progressive interpretations of the Torah. So you're hoping there's a sense of humor when you get there.
Yeah, well, I think there's a lot of humor in my work, even in the work which goes hand in hand with a prayer service, and so that kind of disarms the people who are there. There's a wall up against poetry, to begin with.
Sure.
And I'll say that I've used this exact joke, so I'm not making. Don't think I'm brilliant in coming up with this now, but I'll get in front of people and I say, thank you so much for having me. It's so rare for a poet to have the opportunity to read in front of an audience. Typically when they find out you're a poet, they ask you not to come. So that gets people laughing, and they kind of understand that I'm not necessarily. I'm going to be reading stuff that has a depth to it, that's hopefully going to touch people, but in a way that's accessible, that isn't necessarily using language where you need to really sit with it and interpret it and try to understand it. And I definitely think there's value in the artistry of that work, but that's not how I write. I write kind of straightforward, accessibly. And there is a spirituality to it, and that's not what people always expect. I think a lot of times the people who go to services, they're going because they're supposed to. They're going because their kid's having a bar mitzvah the next time, and so they need to show up and be there, but they don't necessarily want to be there. And that's not everyone. Some people do, and depending on where it is and who the music person is, it may or may not be a very spiritual setting. But my work is funny and has a through line of this of connecting with people's lives and souls, I think, and I've had really good experiences and good feedback and success being in front of these group of people who if you gave them the choice would not want to go to a service where there's going to be a bunch of poetry read.
People come up to you after you're done reading in these synagogues. Is the reaction when they come up and talk to you similar, or does it change back? Or does it change as you go around the country?
It's mostly positive. There's never been negative, as a matter of fact.
Well, how can it be? Listen, it's a personal interpretation of the Torah, right? Isn't that what the Torah is for?
Well, they didn't say don't come back. They didn't say don't come back.
It's not just the Torah, though. I mean, there's all this prayer liturgy and there's other, and just Jewish ideas that I mean, I guess it all kind of stems from the Torah in one way or another, but not all of it is stemming directly from the Torah text. But I don't know, one guy, when I was in Seattle last week, a guy came up to me, and you could tell that this wasn't his thing. From the beginning, I saw him in the audience. At one point, he got up to go to the bathroom, and he came up to me at the end. And there's no obligation for someone to come up to you at the end of a service, and he has to come to the front of the room. The exit's in the back, so he made an effort to do this. This big guy, older guy. This was not his jam, and he goes, I was skeptical at first, but you won me over. I was in Vail, Colorado. I didn't hear this comment directly from the person who said it, but the person who brought me in told me that this guy who was at the service said, he's the greatest living liturgist of our time. And I was like,
no, and here you are.
No, I'm not. So I think it's having an effect. I think it's having its intended effect. I think I'm going over well.
Well, so you're the greatest one we've interviewed.
That's right. You're the best poet we've met.
That may not be true, top of the list. But maybe best poet you've interviewed for this process.
And from the both of us, Richard and myself, we wish you as much success as you could possibly manage to come your way with your poetry and your music and your studies.
Yeah, and thanks for being on Your Next Door Neighbor.
I'm just glad to meet my neighbors.